Sunrise over Angkor Wat. A stone symphony, frozen in anticipation of the first ray of sun. This is the pinnacle of architectural harmony, a prayer in stone, erected by a civilization that aspired to divine order. But behind this facade hid a system that shocked even its medieval contemporaries. In 1296, the Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan impassively recorded, for simple adultery, a person could be clamped in a special device, the gengya, and slowly crushed until their bones cracked. He documented this not as barbarism, but as the norm. How could the creators of such harmony practice such horror? Where was the line between divine order and inhuman cruelty? Were these two different sides of the same empire, or was one built upon the other? In 8 minutes, you will learn how Asia's most humane religion became the ideological justification for the most sophisticated tortures. To find the answer, we must unravel 2 key mysteries. First, how could the great King Jayavarman VII, who built hospitals and made humanistic Buddhism the state religion, preside over a system where torture was a daily reality? We will find the answer to this question in the culmination of our investigation, in Section 8. And the second mystery, why are the walls of sacred temples meant to glorify the gods, carved with such detailed and realistic scenes of the 32 circles of hell? Is this simply mythology or an encrypted catalog of real punishments? We will find the key to this cipher in Section 7. These 2 questions point to the 2 foundations of Khmer power, ideology and its visual embodiment. This investigation will provide you not just with a set of facts, but with an arsenal of 7 keys to the empire's dark side. You will understand the legal mechanism that transformed the king into a god with the right to commit any violence. You will gain access to the records of the sole eyewitness. You will see the complete classification of punishments. You will dissect how the trial by gods with boiling oil worked. And finally, you will learn to read the true, brutal history on the walls of ancient temples. This will forever change your view not only of Angkor, but also of the fundamental link between great culture and systemic violence. Our first key lies not in the laws, but in the very status of the ruler. To understand the origins of the cruelty, we must first understand how the Khmer king legally became a god on earth. How could an entire nation consider brutal tortures not a crime of the state, but its sacred duty? Why were there no rebellions against the most horrific punishments? The answer lies in the first element of our arsenal, the Devaraja Code. According to it, the king was not merely a viceroy, but the earthly incarnation of a god, most often Shiva. His word was not the law of man, but the will of a deity. But when Jayavarman VII came to power and introduced Buddhism, the system did not soften. It became even more sophisticated. A criminal's suffering was now interpreted as a way to cleanse their karma for a better rebirth. Punishment acted as a purifying fire. It burned away the karmic debt in the body so the soul could be reborn pure. The king, by ordering torture, was not punishing but saving.
But this ideology required an absolute leader capable of bringing it to life. And such a leader existed. This fact defies logic. The greatest humanist of the Khmer Empire, Jayavarman VII, was also the architect of one of its most brutal justice systems. He built hundreds of kilometers of roads and 102 hospitals, creating a healthcare network that any country in medieval Europe would have envied. His reign seemed to be the golden age of an enlightened monarch. But his religious reform, the transition to Buddhism, became the ultimate paradox. He did not abolish the old code of divine right to violence. He merely superimposed a new, karmic layer upon it. His absolute power allowed him to reformat religion to suit the needs of the state, showing that even the most peaceful doctrine can serve to justify violence. This absolute power created a vacuum in the official laws, which was filled by something far more terrifying. It was this vacuum that made the system function on the ground. On the numerous stone steles found by archaeologists, laws are indeed inscribed. They regulate temple land ownership, taxes, and ritual rules, creating the impression of an orderly state. But when we search these texts for a criminal code, it isn't there. Official laws contain almost no mention of specific punishments for theft, murder, or treason. Justice was left to the discretion of officials, who acted not based on a legal statute, but on their understanding of the God King's will. The Khmer legal system was like a sieve. It retained taxes and rituals, but everything related to crime slipped through directly into the hands of the enforcers. And the only one who dared to document what this arbitrary power looked like in practice was not a Khmer. How can historians reconstruct a picture of this justice system if the Khmers themselves remain silent about it in their chronicles? This impasse placed researchers in a difficult position. One can rely on indirect evidence, but that's like studying an engine from a blueprint without knowing how it runs. Everything changed at the end of the 13th century. In August 1296, a Chinese delegation arrived at the court of Emperor Jayavarman III. Among its members was an unassuming official named Zhou Daguan. His notes on the customs of Cambodia became the Rosetta Stone for understanding the daily and legal life of the Khmers. What did he record in his report that for 700 years was considered an exaggeration, or even a fabrication? He was not a poet, but a professional official carrying out a mission for his emperor. Zhou Daguan was a pair of eyes and ears for his government. His task was not to praise or condemn, but to understand how this powerful neighboring state was structured. His records are not propaganda, but, in essence, an intelligence report. He describes with equal coolness the wealth of the palace, the primitive daily habits, and the shocking system of justice. It is this detachment that makes his testimony priceless. And the first thing that struck him was not the grandeur of the temples, but how the Khmers resolved disputes. What so astonished a man from a highly developed bureaucratic civilization, where complex legal codes already existed? The first thing he notes is the striking simplicity of the process. There were no lawyers, no lengthy collection of evidence. A local official simply listened to both sides. However, the reality was jarring. If the official could not make a decision, the case was immediately referred to a trial by gods. Dozens of people could be sentenced to an ordeal by boiling oil not for treason against the king, but over a simple dispute about the ownership of a single mango tree. The Khmers were not seeking earthly truth. They were seeking the will of the gods. The trial was not an investigation, but a ritual. But what if the gods remained silent, and punishment was required here and now? That's when a special arsenal came into play. In this brutal system, there were no prisons. This fact, noted by Zhou Daguan, at first glance seems like a sign of humanism. While in other cultures people rotted in dungeons for years, the Khmers, it appears, avoided this. But the reality was the exact opposite. There were no prisons because they were not needed. Punishment was immediate, corporal, and public. Fines existed, but only for the wealthy. For a commoner, the only capital was their body. It became the canvas on which the state painted its laws. More than 10% of all punishments for theft ended in the amputation of fingers or toes. Execution and torture were not just retribution, but public messages. And the arsenal of these messages was truly terrifying. But how can we base an entire investigation on the words of one man? These doubts are entirely legitimate. For centuries, historians considered his notes a collection of exotic exaggerations. However, in the 20th century, with the development of archaeology, indirect confirmations began to emerge. Analysis of burial sites revealed traces of violent death. The study of bas-reliefs showed a striking resemblance between mythological tortures and those described by Daguan. A comparison with the laws of neighboring kingdoms revealed similar practices. His report ceased to be a lone voice. There are 3 types of circumstantial evidence: marks on bones, images on stone, and the laws on the steles of neighbors. What do you think is more compelling evidence? A detailed written report from an eyewitness, or scattered archaeological finds? The answer to this question is provided by the very anatomy of the punishments Daguan described. Let's start with the most common crime: theft. The captured person was first interrogated. If they confessed and returned the stolen goods, they were punished with caning. But if the thief did not confess, a system of marking came into force. Their fingers or toes were cut off. This was not a rare occurrence. By some estimates, up to 10% of theft punishments involved amputation. Thus, a visible social class of the marked was created in the cities. These people were like dead trees in a living forest. Their appearance served as a constant reminder to others of the power of the state. But if a crime against property was punished with such mutilation, the penalty for a crime against honor was even more personal. For adultery, the state practically washed its hands of the matter. The wronged husband was given full authority to personally torture and even kill his wife's lover. This was a privatization of violence, sanctioned by the state. One outcome of such private vengeance could be the use of the gengya, a special wooden clamp that slowly crushed the limbs. The torture could last for hours. The wooden blocks would slowly squeeze the victim's shin until the tibia shattered into fragments beneath the skin. But even this brutality was punishment for a crime against a person. What awaited those who committed a crime against the God King himself? The most serious crime was high treason. Such an act was directed not against a person, but against the entire world order. And the punishment for it was total. The traitor was taken outside the city walls. A pit was dug, and they were buried alive, with the earth packed down firmly. This was not just murder, but a ritual return to the earth, an erasure of the person from existence, denying them a normal rebirth. Moreover, their entire family was persecuted. The system did not just eliminate a threat, it uprooted it completely. But all these punishments were for those whose guilt was considered obvious. What if there were doubts? How could such a system function without constant rebellions? The answer lies not only in fear. The cruelty was legitimized in the eyes of the populace through religion and ritual. Punishment was perceived not as arbitrary, but as a manifestation of divine justice. A key element of this legitimization was the trial by gods, used in doubtful cases. This was a mechanism that removed responsibility from individuals and placed it on higher powers, making any verdict indisputable. We have seen how obvious crimes were punished. Now, let's find out how justice was served when there was no evidence at all. This is precisely why the ordeal, or trial by gods, the fourth element of our arsenal, existed. Its principle was simple. The accused was subjected to a deadly test. If they survived, it was believed that the gods had performed a miracle and protected them. If they died or were maimed, their guilt was proven. But here's what lies behind this description. According to Daguan, this was not a rare event reserved for matters of state importance. Ordeals were used constantly, even in minor disputes over crops, involving dozens of people. The ordeal acted as a pressure release valve for society. Instead of people seeking revenge on each other for years, the ritual instantly released the conflict's tension, and the decision became final. Let's examine the three most common types of these trials. Let's start with the mildest, which Zhou Daguan calls the trial by towers. How could two stone towers determine who was right? At first glance, the procedure seems passive. The plaintiff and defendant were forced to sit in two separate towers opposite each other. They simply waited. For a day, 2, sometimes 4. There was no physical contact.
Everything changes when we learn the criterion for guilt. The one who fell ill, developed sores, started coughing, or ran a fever, was considered guilty. This was a bet on pure psychosomatics. The Khmers intuitively understood that colossal stress and guilt undermine the immune system. In essence, it was a lie detector based on the fear of divine punishment. The trial could last up to 4 days, 96 hours of continuous pressure and solitude. But this was the most bloodless ordeal. It gets worse from here. When a more explicit divine intervention was required, 2 elements came into play: fire and water. The accused had to retrieve a red-hot piece of metal from a fire with their bare hand, or plunge their hand into boiling oil. Alternatively, they were submerged in water and had to stay under for an unnaturally long time. What were their chances? Practically zero. Suffering terrible burns or drowning was almost inevitable. This was not a test, but a disguised execution that looked like a fair trial. The system was designed for the accused to perish. But this is precisely what made the rarest cases of survival a true miracle, which would become a legend and reinforce faith in the system. Zhou Daguan describes it with cold horror. A person was forced to put their hand into a cauldron of boiling oil. He could hear the skin crackle, but screaming was forbidden, as it was considered a sign of guilt. But there was a third, most spectacular ordeal, designed for the eyes of the king himself. The ultimate appeal to the will of the gods was the trial in the royal moat. A huge moat, 100 meters wide, a veritable lake, was dug around the palace in Angkor. According to Daguan's testimony, crocodiles were kept there, and in special enclosures nearby, tigers, symbols of royal power. 2 disputants could simply be thrown into this moat. If the predators did not touch them, they were considered innocent. This was an absolute transfer of judgment into the hands of animals, which were perceived as executors of the divine will. Justice turned into a deadly show, a gladiatorial combat where the arbiter was a wild beast. And this brings us to a key idea. All these punishments and ordeals had one thing in common. They were public. In the next section, we will understand why all this cruelty had to become the empire's main spectacle. Why did an empire capable of building Angkor Wat need to turn punishment into a primitive public spectacle? At first glance, the answer is simple: deterrence. This is the 5th element of our arsenal: punishment as spectacle. The state demonstrated its power to maintain order through fear. It seems that's all there is to it. But the reality was more sophisticated. In Khmer society, where literacy was the privilege of the elite, written decrees were ineffective. Execution became the only form of non-verbal communication understood by all. The criminal's body became a living parchment on which the state wrote its laws in blood. This system worked not like a book that one must know how to read, but like a fire. Its heat was felt by everyone equally, regardless of education. Zhou Daguan coolly recorded that executions were often held in the southern square of the capital, turning the central public space into a permanent theater of power. But this theater also had another, less obvious social function, related not to division, but to the unification of society. How could a spectacle full of horror not repel, but on the contrary, unite society? The picture changes when we shift the focus from the victim to the crowd. Watching the suffering of a criminal psychologically separated each spectator from the other, the deviant element. This created a collective sense of us, the law-abiding majority, against him. Every commoner, seeing the torment of the transgressor, felt their loyalty to the crown and their belonging to the common order. The execution did not so much punish one person as it united all the others. It was a ritual of collective purification, where society expelled its impurities and reaffirmed its devotion to the God King. But where today, can we find visual confirmation of this theater of horror. Echoes of this bloody spectacle are encoded where you would least expect them. In the sacred art, on the walls of the great temples. Despite the importance of public punishments, we do not find a single bas-relief that directly depicts a real earthly execution. Why? The simple explanation is that the art of the temples had a sacred status. Its purpose was to glorify the gods, not to document a dirty reality. Scenes of executions were considered unworthy. But here's what the walls hide if we look at them from a different angle. The artists could not depict real tortures in their earthly context, but they could depict them in a mythological one, as punishments for sinners in hell. This discovery changes everything. The temple walls transform from mythological illustrations into an encrypted catalog of real punishments. Here is Zhou Daguan's description of torture by a press, and here is a similar image on a bas-relief of hell. The southern gallery of Angkor Wat depicts 32 separate scenes of infernal torments, stretching over 49 meters. Now the temple walls cease to be mere illustrations and become silent witnesses. In the next section, we will make them speak. We have examined 4 pillars of Khmer power: the devaraja ideology, Daguan's testimony, the arsenal of pain, and the trial by gods. At first glance, it seems that fear alone held the empire in check. A power capable of inflicting unimaginable suffering appears omnipotent. This model of governance through fear is simple and understandable. But if it were only about fear, the system would have been a primitive tyranny. The reality is more complex. The devaraja ideology was primary. It didn't just justify violence. It transformed it from an act of cruelty into a sacred ritual. Faith gave violence legitimacy, and violence made faith tangible. The king himself might personally attend ordeals, acting not as a tyrant, but as a high priest. And the most complete proof of this inseparable synthesis awaits us where mythology meets reality. In 3 minutes, we will decipher the bas-reliefs of Angkor Wat, and you will see how real tortures were transformed into divine art. What is actually depicted on the famous bas-reliefs of the Gallery of Hell at Angkor Wat. Before us are detailed scenes of sinners being punished under the supervision of Yama, the god of death. The traditional explanation is that this is didactic art, a reminder of the consequences of violating Dharma. It seems logical. But the picture changes completely when we compare these stone images with the records of Zhou Daguan. Dozens of shocking coincidences emerge. On the bas-relief, people are being crushed by presses, and Daguan describes the gengya, torture device. These parallels are too precise to be coincidental. The gengya, torture device, for the slow crushing of limbs, described by Daguan, almost perfectly matches the depiction of a press for sinners on bas-relief number 14 in the Gallery of Hell. Myth becomes evidence. But why was it necessary to depict everything so precisely? Why was it so important for the Khmers to depict hell not abstractly, but with naturalistic precision? The answer lies not in art, but in politics. The standard function of such images, religious edification, does not explain this brutal realism. The nuance that changes everything is their location. The galleries were on mass pilgrimage routes, where they were seen by thousands of people. This was the equivalent of a modern propaganda billboard, broadcasting the idea of inevitable punishment 24/7. But it was an advertisement not only for posthumous retribution, but also for earthly power. The king on earth is a reflection of the god Yama in hell. Earthly justice is merely a prelude to heavenly justice. The bas-reliefs did not just scare people with hell, they legitimized the king's cruelty. These bas-reliefs worked like a filter. They strained out the human cruelty of the king, leaving only divine justice for the people. But the truly chilling part is how the sculptors could have known these details with such accuracy. Where did so much living, genuine suffering in stone come from? The muscles are tensed. The face is contorted in agony. The sculptors conveyed the human body's reaction to pain with anatomical precision. This is a level of realism difficult to achieve through imagination alone. Here we propose a bold hypothesis. Dozens of sculptors may have systematically attended real executions and tortures to sketch details for their subsequent work in stone. This turns celebrated masters into witnesses and accomplices of the system. Dozens of master stone carvers, their names erased by time, might have listened for hours to the screams of the tortured, only to later reproduce their agony in stone with a chisel. Their art is an unwitting, encrypted chronicle of state terror. This whole complex system seems unbreakable. But what if it was this very system that destroyed the empire? So what picture emerges? We have assembled 6 key elements: the God-King ideology, the eyewitness testimony, the arsenal of torture, the trial by gods, the theater of horror, and its reflection in stone. These are parts of a single mechanism. At first glance, this system seems absolutely invulnerable. It controls not only bodies but also souls. Ideology justifies cruelty, and cruelty confirms ideology. A perfect machine of oppression. But its greatest vulnerability lies precisely in this totality. A system that lacks flexibility becomes fragile. It exhausts its main resource: people, their loyalty, and their will to live. The construction of a vast number of temples required colossal resources against the backdrop of destroying the workforce through the punishment system. It was a perfect storm. The great empire did not fall to enemy attacks. It rotted from within. In the next culminating section, we will prove that the Khmer Empire killed itself. How could one of the most powerful empires in Southeast Asia, which built cities of stone, disappear so suddenly and catastrophically? Official versions point to external factors. Historians speak of prolonged wars with Siam. They mention climate change and droughts that undermine the complex irrigation system. But all these factors befell an empire already mortally weakened from within. And it was weakened by its own system of justice. More than 10% of punishments for theft involved amputation. This means the empire purposefully and on an industrial scale created an army of cripples, unable to work in the fields, build temples, or serve in the army. Imagine a village where every 10th man can hold neither a sword nor a plow. This was a slow economic suicide. While the elite built temples to the glory of the gods, the justice system was destroying those by whose labor that greatness was created. And at the center of this process stood a great reformer, whose actions only accelerated the catastrophe. We return again to the biggest mystery: Jayavarman VII. How could a ruler who adopted the most humanistic religion preside over such a brutal system? Was he a hypocrite? His reform was a sincere spiritual choice. He built hospitals and cared for his people. This explanation was dominant for a long time, but the facts refute this benevolent theory. Jayavarman's reform was a desperate political measure. He inherited a country on the brink of economic and spiritual crisis. He needed a new, unifying ideology, and Buddhism was a perfect fit. But he could not abolish the old instrument of control: terror. And here's the culminating blow. He did not abolish cruelty. He rebranded it. Torture was transformed from punishment into an act of mercy. On a stele in the Ta Prohm temple, Jayavarman VII had inscribed, "The illnesses of his subjects became his own illnesses." A phrase that takes on a sinister tone in the context of purifying tortures. Were there signs of internal discontent in this empire of total control? At first glance, it seems not. The obvious explanation is that fear was so powerful, it suppressed any thought of resistance. Official chronicles could not mention such events. However, circumstantial evidence tells a different story. Archaeological data show a sharp increase in the number of defensive structures around cities in the late Angkorian period. Mentions of internal enemies become more frequent. A system based on total fear is like ice on a river. As long as the frost, the power, is strong, the ice seems unbreakable. But as soon as a thaw begins, it cracks instantly. Fear is replaced by accumulated hatred. Cruelty ceases to work. The destruction of Hindu symbols after the death of Jayavarman VII was a clear act of ideological rebellion. What happened to this highly complex system of punishment after Siamese forces captured Angkor in the 15th century? At first glance, it seems the system simply collapsed along with the empire. The old gods and old laws were overthrown. But cruelty as such did not disappear. However, and this is the key turning point, it lost its sacred ideological character. It transformed from divine justice, administering cosmic order, into ordinary violence of one person against another. Angkor did not fall when its walls were breached by enemies. It fell the moment its own people stopped believing in the myth upon which everything was built. The faith was gone, and the machine stopped. And now, in the final section, we will bring all 7 keys together to understand the main lesson of this story. We have journeyed through the 7 circles of Khmer justice. Now it is time to assemble this mosaic to see not isolated horrors, but a complete, functioning system. Its foundation: ideology. The first element, the concept of the devaraja, was not an abstraction. It was a tangible reality. The proof, the second element, the records of Zhou Daguan. He documented how the ideology worked in practice, turning the king into a deity with the right to life and death. But how do you convey this idea to millions of illiterate peasants? This is where the 5th element comes in. The theater of horror. Public executions were the primary medium for broadcasting the king's divine status. Each execution was not a punishment but a religious ceremony confirming his power. Together, these 3 elements, the devaraja, Daguan's testimony, and the theater of horror, formed a perfectly oiled propaganda machine. Ideology granted the right to violence. Violence proved the reality of the ideology, and an eyewitness confirmed it was not fiction. We have seen the software of this system. But what specific tools did it use? If ideology was the brain of the system, its hands were the tools of coercion. The third element, the arsenal of pain, from severed fingers to the Gang Ya device, was not just a collection of tortures. It was a vocabulary where each crime had a corresponding punishment, understood without translation. When earthly logic was insufficient, the 4th element came into play: the trial by gods. The ordeal by boiling oil was a way to shift responsibility to the heavens, making any verdict indisputable. This transformed justice from a human affair into a divine one. And to ensure no one forgot this language of pain, it was immortalized in stone. The 6th element, the silent evidence of Angkor, is a granite cheat sheet for the people. Looking at the bosses saw reliefs of hell, every Khmer. Saw not myths, but a catalog of what awaited them for disobedience, both on earth and in the heavens. The arsenal of pain, the trial by gods, and the evidence in stone were not manifestations of cruelty. They were a systemic language through which power spoke to the people. A language where, instead of words, there was pain, fear, and stone. And this language had one ultimate goal. Now that we see the entire system, we can answer why it collapsed. The 7th element provides the answer: collapse through cruelty. This entire complex machine, from ideology to bas reliefs, ran on one fuel: human suffering. In the short term, this seemed effective. but in the long term, it was a path to self-destruction. A system that systematically maims and kills its subjects destroys its own economic and military power. It devours the very resource it is meant to protect. Cruelty is a non-renewable resource of governance. When it becomes the norm, ever-increasing cruelty is required for control. This leads to the exhaustion not only of the economy, but also of the national spirit. Faith in the king's divinity is replaced by hatred for a tyrant. The empire was like a tower built on an avalanche. While everything was still, it seemed majestic, but the slightest tremor, and the foundation of fear and bones crumbled. Angkor Wat and the killing fields are not two different civilizations, but one and the same. Greatness built on cruelty is not sustainable. This story happened 800 years ago. But do we not see its echoes even today? We have come the full circle. Now that you hold all 7 keys, it is time for one final question, addressed personally to you. What was the true foundation of this civilization that created both Angkor Wat and an unimaginable system of punishment? What was primary? Was it the boundless, sincere faith of the people in the divinity of their ruler, which allowed them to accept the most terrible penalty as their due? Or was it the primal, all-pervading fear of his cruelty, which paralyzed any will to resist? This is not just a historical question. It is a question about the nature of all power. What holds a society in check more strongly? An idea that is believed, or violence that is feared? We ask you to make a choice. Write just one word in the comments below this video. Faith or fear. No long explanations. Just your conclusion after everything you have seen. Let's see what answer our collective consciousness gives to the ultimate lesson, carved in the stones of Angkor.